everybody, it's Laurie White, the Providence Chamber of Commerce, back with another edition of Chamber TV. This is episode number 132, and we have a popular topic today, and I know that we have a lot of folks watching that have signed up early to be part of this session. We are live on YouTube, we are live on Facebook, and we are live on Twitter, and we are talking about return to the office and vaccination policies and everything that employers and workers need to know about this very sensitive, timely, delicate, highly personal, but highly relevant topic to everybody. So we're going to be approaching it from a labor law perspective, and we have two experts from Partridge, Hahn who are coming to us from a labor law perspective. They are specialists in employment law, and they have done a lot of study, research, comparison about what other states are doing, and they are subject matter experts on this topic. So I'm pretty confident everybody will walk away after the next 40 minutes or so with a better understanding of how to approach this subject, questions you can ask, things that you can mandate, things that you cannot mandate, and just ways in general that employers might approach this topic. So please join me in welcoming Alicia Samolis and Phoebe Roth from Partridge, Hahn. Thanks for coming back again. We have tapped into you folks many, many times. Alicia and Phoebe will talk about some of these key issues, whether it be COVID in the first instance, but now, thinking back and how far that we have been, we've come to this point now to be able to hone in on vaccination strategies. So welcome, and let me turn it over to you for your deck.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Laurie. So as Laurie said, I'm Alicia Samolis. I'm a partner at Partridge, Hahn, and I'm the chair of the Labor and Employment Group. So about half of what I do is employment litigation. I represent employers who get sued by their employees for things like wage and hour violations, accommodation violations, and a whole host of COVID issues. And the other half of what I do is compliance-based. I do manager trainings, policies, and I advise employers on things like terminations and whether to mandate the vaccine. And I'm here today with my associate, Phoebe Roth. So before getting into the material, I'll just mention that I'd love to get some questions, comments. Please just type them in as we go. The one thing I'll just warn you about is, remember, this is not attorney-client privileged. While we are attorneys, this is discoverable. So please refrain from admitting that either you or your company is doing something illegal or has done something illegal in the past. So today we're going to talk about employer vaccine policies. And we're going to start by talking about vaccine mandates. One big question all of my clients are asking is, can I mandate my employees get the vaccine? And after answering that question, Phoebe's going to touch a little bit on vaccine incentives, both positive and negative incentives. And then I'll talk about vaccine tracking, not having a vaccine policy. And we'll close by touching upon a couple other COVID-related issues. So Phoebe will explain the current COVID orders in effect for employers who have not had a lot of people in the office. They might be surprised to learn they have some new legal obligations. And for our employers that have been back in person the whole time, they will be delighted to know we have new regulations that just came out over the weekend. So there's some things to know there. And then at the very end, I'll talk about getting employees back to work. Specifically, I know a lot of my clients are having a problem when they call back their employees. Either they call back them from furlough and they're not ready to get back to work, or they're calling back remote employees. And those remote employees might want to stay home, or at least stay home for some time. So thinking first about vaccine mandates. Everyone's asking the question, can I mandate employees get the vaccine? Meaning adopt a policy that says, look, in order to work for me, you have to be vaccinated. And if you choose not to get vaccinated, you're going to get fired. And many clients and many employees are very surprised to learn that the general answer to this question is yes. So in the general sense, yes, you can mandate employee vaccines. Now, of course, you can tell by the list on the slide, there are some legal issues, there are some exceptions, there are some business issues. We're going to talk through all of those. But at the very outset, it's important to realize that this is not a new rule. So you probably know that we do have some special COVID rules in effect right now that are allowing employers to do things that they normally could not do. Those rules will go away once the CDC or the World Health Organization says we're out of the pandemic. And those special rules I'm referring to are the allowance of employers to take COVID tests, to take temperature checks, to have those screening questions about whether employees have shortness of breath or diarrhea. All those go away when COVID ends. The vaccine mandate allowance is nothing new. Essentially, the EEOC and state agencies and courts have found that vaccines that are widely available and that don't require a doctor prescription and don't require a nurse prescription are not medical treatments, and they're not subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act and all those state laws, which normally protect employees from employers imposing medical rules and even asking about medical questions. So we're outside the purview of all those restrictions. Now, that said, that doesn't mean there are not any exceptions to this general allowance on vaccine mandates. One big one would be if your employees have an employment contract. So employment contract in this day and age is pretty rare. You generally see that in a couple contexts. One is your high-level executives might have an employment contract. And in that context, you can still have a policy that mandates the vaccine. What the contract might restrict is your ability to terminate when the person doesn't follow the policy. So if you do have employment contracts that guarantee employment for a particular period, you're going to want to look at those. And you're going to want to see, can I use this as a termination reason if someone doesn't follow my policy? And if I do terminate, am I going to owe severance? So I have not obviously read your particular employment contracts, but in the general sense, I'm pretty confident that they're not going to allow you to terminate somebody and not pay severance or not breach the contract. So please, if you are an employer out there with employment contracts, look at those before you start terminating people. The other context would be employers out there that have a contract with a union, a collective bargaining agreement. If you have a union, you need to talk to your union representative, not only before you start firing people for not getting the vaccine, but even before you institute a vaccine mandate or a negative incentive that Phoebe's going to talk about. So two very small exceptions right at the outset. The other exception that does come up is the issue of reasonable accommodations. So just like any other policy, you can institute it, but if you have a specific employee that comes forward and says, look, I cannot get the vaccine because I have a medical issue or it's contrary to my religious beliefs, you have to engage in the interactive process. Same rules apply to the interactive process. Essentially, if it's a medical issue, you're asking for documentation from a doctor, from a healthcare provider, validating this, saying, yes, this person has this medical condition, they are severely allergic to certain ingredients, and therefore should not get the vaccine. If you find yourself in that position, you still can consider, is this an undue burden? But for every business, other than some rare exceptions for healthcare providers, potentially, people working in nursing home, potentially, you're probably going to have to accommodate that and let that specific employee continue to work for you, even if they're not vaccinated. With the religious accommodation, I will say this is a rare one. So employers sometimes are not that familiar with how the interactive process works. But unfortunately for a religious accommodation, there's not much documentation you're going to be able to get. You can get a certification from the employee that says they have a deeply held religious belief or spiritual belief, and it's contrary to that belief. So you can make the employee sign off on that one. I will tell you that's pretty much all you can do. You can't go the further step and say, well, what part of this religion are you part of? Is it an established religion? Cannot do that. You can't say, well, how long have you had this belief? Because maybe you know just yesterday this person was part of a different religion. That's a long way of saying if you have employees who want to lie and get around a vaccine mandate, they could potentially use a religious accommodation to do that. But I have found that it is actually pretty rare. So those are the little exceptions to that general rule of yes. So beyond whether you can, there are some other legal issues you should be aware of. One big one is that if you have hourly paid employees, non-exempt employees, they're not paid a salary for all hours worked, then you potentially are going to need to pay these employees for the time it takes to get the vaccine. And when I say that, I mean the full time, the travel time, the sign up time, the waiting time, the 15 minutes they make you sit there to see if you're going to have an allergic reaction time, all that time is paid. Now, remember, if you are an employer that has less than 500 people, we still have the FFCRA in place on a voluntary basis. So the Family First Coronavirus Response Act allows employers to pay employees for the time it takes to get the vaccine, the full time, and the time it takes to recover. And employers can take a full tax deduction on their payroll taxes for that cost, up to $511 per day. So you can't do more than $511 per day on your taxes to get the money back. So some of your highly paid employees, if they're hourly, you might not be able to get the full cost, but that still is a good mechanism to recoup your cost. Now remember, like all other FFCRA leave, the person has to miss work for you to get that tax credit. So if you're looking to take advantage of that, my suggestion would be that your policy reads, we're mandating the vaccine, and if you're hourly, we're going to pay you for it, but you got to go during working time. That way, you know you're going to get your money back. So beyond the fundamental legal issues, the biggest issue you should be thinking about is a business issue. And that issue is employees are reacting very negatively to these mandates. So I've had plenty of clients survey the workforce. Some have even implemented the mandate. And I will tell you, I have been very surprised about how strongly people feel against vaccine mandates. And it includes employees who actually do get the vaccine, want the vaccine, have already gotten it. They tend to feel like this is a violation of their rights, even though I just told you it's not. And it's something to keep in the back of your mind, in particular, because a lot of employers are also struggling having people work. There is a kind of a shortage in willing bodies who want to work right now. The other thing I'll mention on that end is that if you are an employer that has a workforce that's likely to unionize, I would think long and hard about a mandate, because this could be how you're going to buy yourself a union in the workplace, which is horrible and which I guarantee would not be worth the mandate. So that's not my way of saying don't do it, but eyes wide open going in. even if you think your workforce is on board with vaccines, they might not be on board with an employer being able to tell people that they have to go get it or they're going to get fired. So there are a few other ancillary legal issues when you think about a vaccine mandate that I want to talk about. One is employer vaccine clinics. So a lot of employers right now have not had the opportunity to actually have a clinic at their own facility. But I anticipate, given the wide availability of vaccines, that we're going to start seeing some of this over the summer, where employers will offer employees the opportunity to get the vaccine right there at their workplace, just like the flu. So employers should be aware they can do that. That's great. But they can't actually mandate that the employee go to that particular clinic. The reason for that is under the current practice of administering the vaccines, you'll see that medical questions are actually asked. You know, the person goes in, they're going to be asked, are they pregnant? Do they have allergies? And the point of that is, you know, to give some additional disclaimers, disclosures, but those are medical inquiries that employers cannot make. So you got to be careful. If you have the clinic, be clear. Great, use the clinic, but you could also go to Walgreens. You could also go to a state-run site if you prefer. Another thing to note is that you cannot tie the mandate deadline to the eligibility of the employee. So you cannot have a policy that says you got to get the vaccine within 8 weeks of when you're eligible. That obviously would require older employees and disabled employees to have to get the vaccine first. So you don't want to tie it to the eligibility. You certainly could tie it to when the policy comes out or just give a date. You could say you got to get it in the next 8 weeks or you're fired, or you got to get it by July 1st or you're fired. But keep in mind, not tied to the eligibility. Everyone luckily is eligible now. The next thing to note is you can't ask for a doctor's note or a healthcare provider note to verify someone has been vaccinated. You can, however, require the vaccine card, a picture of the card, the electronic record, pharmacy email, some other documentation. And by the way, everyone in Rhode Island has an electronic record. They may or may not know this, but if they go onto the portal for the Rhode Island vaccine, they can look up their last name and first name, date of birth, and whatever email or text that they registered to get the vaccine. They'll get a code, and they might be surprised to learn, boop, it pops right up. Now, that only works if you get the vaccine in Rhode Island from either the state of Rhode Island or a pharmacy like Walgreens that's tied in. So, of course, you might have people who got it out of state, but there are various documentation they can present to you. So your policy should just read, you got to show me proof of the vaccine. If the employee chooses to give you a doctor's note, that's totally fine. You haven't violated any laws. That's their option. You can accept that. I wouldn't reject the doctor's note. But the key is you got to draft that a little carefully and not accidentally say, give me your medical documentation. And then very last thing I'm going to note is that we need to keep our eye on pending legislation. So we don't have any legislation yet that affects employer ability to require vaccination or to require documentation to prove someone's been vaccinated. But we are starting to see some legislation being proposed. And we've even seen some legislation pass that affects private business ability to ask for vaccination passports or ask for vaccination documents from their customers or patrons. So most well known is Florida, right? The governor comes out, passes some emergency legislation saying, look, private businesses can't require their customers or their patrons to provide vaccine passports. Again, even in Florida, employers can still do it, but we know where this is going. So I would just be a little careful. make sure that you keep your eye out for any new legislation that passes in the future that might change the analysis. So those are your basic issues with vaccine mandates. So Phoebe's now going to talk about the next level down, vaccine incentives.
Thanks, Alicia. So in addition to the vaccine mandates, another approach towards employee vaccinations is for employers to provide vaccine incentives. There are different kinds of incentives that employers can provide. These include positive incentives and negative incentives. Positive incentives include things like gift cards, extra time off, bonuses, invitations to an event or a company party, or employee gifts. With regard to negative incentives, those would include policies, such as things like non-vaccinated employees cannot come into the office, cannot attend a company event or a party, can't attend in-person meetings, or cannot attend or cannot perform public-facing duties or interact with the public. Now, the same issues apply with respect to vaccine incentives that Alicia discussed with regard to vaccine mandates. So first, reasonable accommodations for a medical or a religious reason will also apply to these vaccine incentives, and employers will need to go through the interactive process with an employee to determine whether or not there is an undue burden. However, with the vaccine incentives, it is probably less likely that you will need to grant an accommodation than for a vaccine mandate. Also, the issue with forcing use of employer clinics, deadlines tied to eligibility, and vaccine documentation will all apply if an employer is choosing to use vaccine incentives with their employees. Another issue to keep in mind is that IRS taxation rules will apply to the vaccine incentives. So W-2 taxes, including withholding and payroll taxes, will have to be paid on cash or gift card incentives or on the value of larger non-monetary gifts. And lastly, the same rules will apply to health savings plan incentives that apply to other vaccine incentives other than taxation.
Phoebe, one other thing I'll note about vaccine incentives is that clients always ask me, well, what are you talking about when you say reasonable accommodation if I have a policy giving people a $100 gift card? And it's a great question, but literally what we're talking about is if somebody comes forward and says, look, I have the medical disability, they go through the interactive process. Yes, they do. They can't get it. They have an allergy. What the employer is required to do is come up with an alternate way they can get that $100 gift card. So hopefully it's just a one-off. I'd say you could say, you know, you got to watch a video on COVID safety and then you get the gift card. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about incentives. It's a little different when we're talking about mandates because it's, you know, you're allowing the person in the workplace when you wouldn't normally. When it's an incentive, you got to figure out an alternate way for them to get the positive thing or to avoid the negative thing. If it's a negative incentive saying the person can't come to happy hour if they're not vaccinated, you might be able to get away with that in the middle of the pandemic, but eventually you are going to have to come up with an alternate accommodation. The person has to wear a mask. They got to stand, you know, a little further away from people, or you just let them at the happy hour. So the next type of employer policy is what I call a vaccine tracking policy. And this is our general recommended place for employers to at least start when they start thinking about what kind of vaccine policy should I have. So a vaccine tracking policy is simply a policy that says we are requiring you to report when you get the vaccine. And I would strongly encourage you to word that first dose and second dose if second dose is in play. Because a real part of this policy is for the employer to predict, do I actually need to mandate the vaccine, incentivize the vaccine, as well as to be able to make decisions about other things like workplace rules and whether they should be planning to have more employee absences. So there are very few issues for employers that want to do this. We talked a little bit, you still can't require a doctor's note, but you can require some sort of documentation, and then you look at that information and use it to make good business decisions. There are just a few things I have seen happen with these policies that go wrong. One is that employees still tend to be a little upset sometimes. They don't like being asked for their card or their information. So you might have employees be a little disgruntled, not anywhere close to a mandate or a negative incentive. But because of this, I've seen clients want to say two things. Some clients want to say, look, please give us your vaccine card, but do not give me any medical information. Don't tell me why you're not going to get it. And I understand why an employer might want to say that, because as soon as you learn of a medical issue or religious issue, all of a sudden that employee is protected for a period of time, which means that if they tell you they have that disability on Monday and they can't get the vaccine, it's going to be tough to terminate them on Tuesday. So there's a real business reason you want to avoid getting that information. The other thing I see employers sometimes want to do is say to employees, hey, we're only going to use this for workplace safety and to generally see whether it's safe to call people back to work, a very limited use of the information. You can do both of those things, but if you do, you cannot use the information to make an employment decision about any particular employee. And while sitting here today, you might think, well, I really don't want to do that anyway. I just want the info because I want to know, should I call everyone back 100% now that we can? Or I want the info to see, should I mandate the vaccine? But in reality, you might want to use it for other reasons down the line. You might want to staff certain people in positions that are vaccinated if they're talking to the public. You might, if you have to make tough decisions about layoffs, you might want to choose the employees that are vaccinated because you think they're going to be absent less. If you're assigning people to travel, you might be wanting to choose the vaccinated people because they're not going to be subject to travel orders. So you might really want to use it down the line. If you include in your policy either you can't submit any more info, like medical info, or you say we're only going to use it for XYZ, you do have to send a second email or revise the policy to explain that now you're going to be using it for other purposes and the employee can submit medical documentation or other reasons. You have to afford the employees the opportunity to request the reasonable accommodation if you're going to use the information in a way that could actually affect any particular employee. So this type of policy is a great one to start with. I think it gives you a good amount of information about your workplace, and it might help you make some of the more difficult decisions about, should I actually mandate it? Should I have an incentive? It helps you plan for absences, but you do want to keep those things in mind. I would also recommend that you set up a separate email for getting the vaccine documentation. It does, in practicality, result in employees giving you less medical information, less excuses. If you tell employees, hey, send Lisa, the head of HR, your vaccine card, guess what? They're much more likely to tell Lisa why they are not getting it. Versus if you set up an email like, I got the shot, I got the vaccine, I am vaccinated at company.com, they're much less likely to send the anonymous email that sort of information. There's one other thing I'll say about vaccine tracking. be prepared that probably less of your workforce is vaccinated than you think. I have yet to have one client underestimate their vaccination rate. So clients think that their employees are more vaccinated than they actually are. It appears that people who are not planning to get the vaccine tend not to be vocal about it. So every client I've had that has started tracking this has come back and said, I'm disappointed. It's a lot less people who are getting the vaccine than I thought. I thought much greater number would have been vaccinated by now. So the last thing about vaccine policies I want you to consider is that, of course, you can have no vaccine policy. There is no law that requires you to track vaccines. Phoebe's going to talk a little bit in a minute about how the law does require you to have a policy that requires certain employees to wear masks that are not vaccinated. But you can choose to have no policy, not say anything about it. And if you do that, there is very little legal risk. The risk of liability from somebody catching COVID is very, very low. So whenever you see a contagious illness that's generally in the population, causation is very hard to prove. Somebody's going to have a tough time proving that they got it from the workforce, with some exceptions, like if you have nurses in a COVID unit and you are the nurse employee or other circumstances like that. In addition, COVID is generally a minor infection. So you got to get really unlucky to have somebody get it that has serious damages. And very importantly, for your employee claims, somebody who claims that they got it at work, that sort of claim is covered by workers' compensation, which you know has a lot less damages than a lawsuit, and also carries strict liability, meaning your policy doesn't matter. What you do doesn't matter. Your workplace safety doesn't matter. Strict liability means if they got it at work, just like any other workplace injury, you're on the hook, but it's only for the workers' comp damages, which of course are covered by your insurance policy. Couple other business issues, though, you need to think about if you're not going to have a vaccine policy. The big one is absences. So this has been going on for some time. If you've had employees who have to physically be at work, you know that we have greater absenteeism because people are getting sick. They have to stay home when they're sick. They also are having greater absenteeism because they're subject to quarantine orders. This is very unique to COVID. So we've always had contagious illness and illness in the population. It has always caused sicknesses in employees. But this is the first time we've really seen the government mandate people to stay home in certain circumstances. And of course, one of those circumstances is when somebody has close contact. So if you have a largely unvaccinated workforce, those people are going to have to stay home more. Now, those orders may go away. I would think eventually they will. They're going to be probably the last orders that we have prior to having no orders. But right now we still have them in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And you probably know in both states and in most states, there is now a big exception for when you're vaccinated. So you don't have to stay home if you get close contact if you're vaccinated. Very similar with travel orders. So Massachusetts no longer has one. Rhode Island does. So Rhode Island's travel order says, look, if you travel to a high-risk state or you travel internationally, you have to quarantine for 7 days. If you get a test after the 5th day and you're negative, you can go back to work. If you don't want to get a test, you have to quarantine for 10 days, but you have a huge exception for anyone fully vaccinated. So that is a very big deal. And it's a bigger deal if you're an employer that has to have people travel for work. And it's a bigger deal because you're also dealing with other states' orders. As you can imagine, Rhode Island is not alone in this travel order situation. So if you have an employee who's traveling to a state or even a country that has a quarantine order, that quarantine order, like Rhode Island, may very well have a vaccine exception. They don't all, so you got to make sure you know what the other orders say, but it is not really feasible for someone to travel for work to a state that is not vaccinated, and then there's an order in place and they can't go see the client, do whatever business you need them to do for a week or 2 weeks. So the travel orders and the quarantine orders, if they stick around long enough, might be a reason that you are going to have to mandate the vaccine, or at least track it and make decisions based upon who is vaccinated. One very last thing I'm going to say about vaccine policies: any sort of vaccine policy, mandate, incentive, tracking, does seem to result in less whistleblowing complaints from your worried employees. So who are your worried employees? They're the ones who are complaining to you that they saw somebody without a mask on and they believe that person is not vaccinated. I can't guarantee if you adopt a vaccine policy, that's going to stop 100%, but it does seem to decrease the interest on employees policing things like employees not wearing a mask, even though if they're not vaccinated. So I'm going to turn it over to Phoebe to briefly touch upon some of the COVID restrictions, orders, regulations that are still in effect right now that you need to know about if you're calling employees back to work.
Thanks, Alicia. With regard to other return to work issues and the recent COVID orders, as you may know, we are back at 100% capacity. As you may not know, the COVID regulations have been revised. Most of the previous requirements have been eliminated. For instance, there's no requirement for businesses to have a COVID plan. There are also no longer special cleaning requirements for businesses, and there's no more requirement for contact tracing. However, there are still some regulations in place, and businesses must comply with them. There are also still penalties for not complying, and they're still doing audits. Even if everyone is vaccinated, employers must still follow these local COVID orders. Now, in Rhode Island, as of today, businesses still must hang signs at entrances reminding unvaccinated people to wear masks. Employers must have masks available to their employees. Masks must be worn in schools, healthcare settings, correctional facilities, homeless shelters, and on public transportation. Unvaccinated persons must wear masks when within 3 feet of others. And if an unvaccinated employee refuses to wear a mask, then the employer can't allow them to work, but there's no requirement for the employer to verify the employee's vaccination. Businesses must also hang signs at entrances informing of the symptoms of COVID and advising those who have the symptoms, those who have COVID, or those who have COVID exposure and are not vaccinated, that they cannot enter the building. Businesses must also exclude people with visible signs of COVID or those who have informed the employer that they have symptoms of COVID, but there's no required screening or monitoring other than the posters. Businesses must hang additional posters that are available on health.ri.gov, or they can hang self-created signs with the same information. And lastly, businesses must cooperate with the Department of Health if they're contacted with COVID exposure or cases. Now, in Massachusetts, there are still various current restrictions, including 50% office capacity and the requirement to wear masks indoors when closer than 6 feet to others. However, the governor has expressed the intention to lift all COVID workplace restrictions and mask restrictions on May 29th.
Thank you, Phoebe. So just a couple other things I want to touch on, and then we'll get to all your questions that hopefully you've sent in. Two big other return to work issues. One is people are calling their employees back either because they're on furlough or they've been working from home, and they're expecting them to be excited to come back to the workplace. Finally, we're at 100%, and they're finding things are not going in that direction. We have furloughed employees who want to stay on their furlough longer, and we have people who are working from home that either want to continue working from home or they want to continue for at least a particular period of time. So from the legal sense, you can require people to come back to work. I know that seems obvious, but this is a question I get all the time. Hey, someone called me. They really they're not ready. They're scared to come back into the workplace. Yeah, they are vaccinated, or maybe they're not vaccinated. They don't want to get the vaccine. They're scared. They want to keep working from home. Can I require them to come back? Yes, absolutely. Nothing has changed in this regard. If you want people back in the office, you want to call people back from furlough, you can tell them they have to. If they don't, you can terminate them. The exceptions that exist are similar to what we talked about with a vaccine mandate. If you have a contract guaranteeing their employment, you have to read it. But unlike a vaccine mandate, I feel pretty comfortable saying there's a very good chance you're still going to be able to terminate. It's going to be under the for-cause provision. Generally, when people draft these contracts, they're not drafting them in a way where the employee can refuse to work or refuse to work in person. Same with a union contract, a collective bargaining agreement. Yes, you got to make sure you contact your union representative before you terminate anyone. Make sure there's no procedure where they get warnings and discipline. But generally, you can terminate. There is still the accommodation issue relating to medical, not really religious. It would have to be very, very unusual case. Definitely call your attorney if you get one. If somebody says it's against their religion to return to work in person or even return to work, period. But in any case, seems pretty clear. You could probably terminate. It's an undue burden. But with medical, it does pop up in one particular context. If you have an employee who says they have a serious medical condition, presently making them unable to work, then you're going to have to go through that accommodation process. For employees who just want to work from home, that basically only means anxiety. So if they have a real anxiety disorder, they might be allowed to get an accommodation to work from home longer. It's an interesting one. Prior to COVID, that would have definitely been an undue burden. Really, the accommodation laws did not account for people who didn't want to work in person. Now, I think we're going to have to look at that more carefully. The other type of people that might have a medical issue are those who had their elective surgery. They had their knee replacement. They didn't think you were going to call them back in person, or they didn't think you were going to call them back from furlough. And now they have a separate medical issue. Obviously, you might have to accommodate that. I will tell you, if they're on furlough, make sure you call them back and then put them on a medical leave. Sounds complicated, but if you don't do that, you don't get the clock running on the accommodation laws, the FMLA laws. So make sure what you don't do is say to someone on furlough, sure, we'll just extend your furlough date because of your medical issue. No, you call them back and then you place them on the unpaid leave if you're unlucky enough to have that situation. It is not covered if somebody does not want to return to work in person or doesn't want to return from furlough because they're scared of COVID. Even if they have diabetes, even if they're overweight, even if they have asthma, even if they have a lung condition, even if on top of that they have an allergy and cannot get the vaccine. That is not a present inability to work. If it's a potential for a more serious case of COVID, it's a potential to get COVID more often, then it's not covered. You can force that person to work and force that person to work in person. Same thing with issues of childcare. If the person no longer has childcare and says that's the reason they can't come to work and they got rid of the childcare in COVID, that's not protected. You can still require them to work and you can still require them to work in person. Very, very narrow exception to that. Despite the fact that the legal exception is narrow, the business issues are much broader. I would encourage you to be a little careful about pulling the trigger and terminating everyone who's not back in the office or that doesn't want to come back from furlough. Essentially, we have a situation where the workforce is limited that we can pull from. We have a group of people who don't want to work. Essentially, we have people collecting unemployment, which is $300 extra under the federal law that expires at the end of September. And then we also have people who are getting free health insurance under that brand new law, the ARPA. So hopefully if you have more than 20 people and you have a healthcare plan, you know what I'm talking about. But this brand new law says, guess what? Employers have to pay for COBRA in all these situations, and then the employer gets the tax credit. This has resulted from a group of employees being on unemployment, getting free health insurance, and not wanting to work. So our labor pool is smaller to draw from. So a lot of clients in a whole broad range of industries are finding they cannot hire people. They can't recruit them. So if you're trying to make the decision about, okay, should I terminate somebody because they won't come back in the office, you very well may want to let them work from home longer, or at least give them more time to get their affairs in order, to let them get their childcare in order, to get used to the fact that they're going to be back in the office, to get the vaccine because they haven't done anything about it, so they even didn't try to get the first shot, to get the new lease on their car so they can get to your workplace. Because of the labor pool, I would be very careful about not over terminating, being overly forceful, that you actually might want to be. One very last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Laurie for questions. The other legal question I'm getting a lot is working from home arrangements. A lot of employers are going the opposite direction. They're not forcing people back to the office. They're allowing people to continue to work from home. Two big legal issues from this. If they're hourly, not salaried, non-exempt, there's a real risk of them working off the clock, not reporting hours. You really need to implement some additional policies about that. And you probably are going to need to do some spot checking audits to make sure they are reporting all their time. The second one is that we are finding when we're calling people back to work, they've moved out of state, or they want to move. If you are finding this, you need to call your attorney. There's three big issues here. One is that you're going to be subject to another state law. That's fine. We can work through it. Depending on the employee and what state they move to, you may or may not want to do it. If they move to Texas, not really a big deal from the employment law issue. Few extra policies. If it's California, much bigger issue. You're going to need a new vacation policy. You're going to need potentially short-term disability. You're going to need to know a whole bunch of other things. Still doable. Your attorney also needs to talk to you about tax issues. You might have not been aware, but during COVID, a lot of the emergency orders allowed employers to ignore the normal tax laws and continue paying people as normal. Rhode Island was one of those states. That order expires July 17th. It's been extended month to month. It might be extended more. That order basically says, hey, if you have an employee that's working in Rhode Island, and the only reason that's happening is because that's where they lived originally, and you're an out-of-state employer, you don't have business here, you don't have to pay taxes in Rhode Island. But it says the converse. If you're a Rhode Island employer and your employee moved to Texas, we still want that tax. So a lot of states dealt with this, but all those orders will go away, and you're very likely going to have to pay taxes to a different state And you might already have to as of today. Very last thing you're going to talk to your attorney about, registering to do business. So each state has a different rule about whether you have to register to do business in that state. One factor that goes into that is having an employee permanently working there, even if it's from their house. So that's my last thing on my list. Laurie, I'll turn it over to you, see how our questions are doing.
Phoebe, that was a lot. That was a real lot. I can imagine that people's heads are spinning at this moment in time. But I think the big takeaway is, if when in doubt, don't without consulting your attorney. There are a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of details and accommodations that must be made. It's a very fluid situation. The laws and the regulations are changing regularly on a daily basis or a monthly basis. You referenced a couple of deadlines that are coming up that may in fact be extended. So what I'm taking away from it is, the need to really take each and every utterance and decision very, very, carefully, because there's a lot at stake from a liability perspective and potential unionization perspective, and the like. And who knows what's coming down the pike, as you said, to watch out for, future pieces of legislation that will really bind employers in this regard.
Absolutely. And we do try to update our website with these developments pretty close in time. The website is on that slide right there. Don't hesitate to go on. You'll see the COVID orders getting updated. Laurie, were there any specific questions that you wanted us to answer?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that we're seeing. The first is, can employees ask other employees whether they've been vaccinated?
Absolutely. So employees, there's not a lot of restrictions on what they can do. So they can definitely ask other employees if they're vaccinated. As you can probably imagine, since the employer themselves can ask, there's no even bar on a supervisor asking. So there's really no restriction there. So that, of course, can create some distraction in the workplace. You might want to address it just from a business standpoint and say, look, we don't want people asking other people because, it's a private issue. That way you can avoid any disputes or conflicts in the workplace. But legally, there's no restriction to do one way or the other.
And what if an employee says he or she is uncomfortable being in the workplace with other employees that may or may not be vaccinated? I know we sort of got into that, but.
Yeah. So you can definitely fire them. As I tried to touch on a little bit, I would be a little more generous just right now, especially if you're in an industry where you don't have a good pool of people that you can staff from. But as a general rule, what you should be saying is, look, we got to get back to normal, and you're absolutely free to terminate somebody like that.
So do you think there is any such definition as normal and everything we've gone through?
I think it's a fair question, because I think we know that there are going to be some changes going forward. I mean, the biggest change I see is client willingness to have people work from home. And that will affect the entire industry, because if somebody wants to work from home and now you know that your competitors are allowing it, then potentially that means you have to allow it. Obviously, there are some jobs you can't do from home. But I do think that will be a lasting effect, is more willingness to let people work at alternate work locations.
What are most people doing right now, Alicia and Phoebe? I know it varies. It depends on whether you're working at a small privately held company where the individuals and you have your own pod. But what are the major employers doing today, and has that changed over the last month, where the target was maybe, we'll bring everybody back in January, then it kind of backed up to September, and then now some are backing up even further and saying, well, I think we're going to have people back, June, July. What are you seeing?
So one common thing that I'm seeing, and it's also something that I recommend, is that if you are finding that you have welcomed people back to the office and people aren't coming back to the office, to give some employees lead time. So it's a way to very strongly say to the employees, you need to get back by X date, but allowing them some time to phase into it. And I suggest this because what I'm finding a lot is that employees were taken aback by how fast we got to where we were. And it was pretty fast. I mean, kind of accelerated schedule. You heard Phoebe talk about Massachusetts going to get rid of all their rules May 29th. Rhode Island, we got 100% May 21st. That was a lot sooner than I think a lot of people anticipated. So they're not really set up as far as childcare, dog care. They're not maybe set up transportation-wise. They may not be set up because they scheduled all their doctor's appointments and appointments in the middle of the day, thinking they're working from home. They can just kind of adjust their schedule. So one thing I would recommend and what I've seen is that companies have started to give a little lead time. They might have said, you're welcome back. We're at 100%. They looked around. They only have 50% back. And then there's a second email that goes out. Hey, guess what? After 4th of July, or on some of the big employers, I've even seen after Labor Day, you're back. But it gives the employees some time to phase in. When you think about that, the other thing you should think about is, has it been working out having people work from home? If people have been working from home very effectively, it's not really a rush to get them back. You can also kind of target people who maybe are struggling working from home, they're distracted. And for those people, say, we need you back in 2 weeks. For the people that are working from home and are doing great, you can give them a much longer period, or even think about a hybrid work situation, a full remote situation.
What about the issue of long haulers? And maybe, Phoebe, I'll ask you that question. And we were talking about it today. We had some business leaders cautioning that some folks that have had COVID have some very serious long tail issues, as it were, and chronic fatigue syndrome and other things as a direct result of having COVID, and then implications downstream for their ability to really be fully present. Have you encountered any of that?
Laurie, I haven't personally encountered those issues, but Alicia may have. Alicia, have you had any experience with that you want to talk about?
I just said it is pretty rare. But yes, if you do get somebody who says, I'm a long hauler, I had COVID, I have side effects, you need to treat it exactly like any other medical accommodation. Review their doctor's notes, and then discuss what accommodation would allow them to do their job. So, it might be a period of unpaid leave. It might be a different job duty. If they're tired all the time, maybe you're adjusting their work schedule and putting them on a second shift versus a first shift. So same idea. You need to get the medical documentation first to verify that this is a real medical condition, affects the ability to do the job, and then see what they propose as an accommodation. Unfortunately, something like that, it might be very hard for them to even think of an accommodation. If someone's tired all the time, that really is hard to accommodate other than by unpaid leave, so they have a chance to recover.
Mm-hmm. You both described a situation of concentration issues, of being in the numbers of individuals in the workplace, even though the rules and regulations have been relaxed in that respect. But do you want to outline, for example, what Partridge, Snow, and Hahn is doing relative to keeping a requisite number in the building, in the office, and scheduling that long term, so that there is coverage, but there also is some flexibility around density issues?
Yeah. So we did a really great job here. What we did is we identified people that really needed to be in the office. So for us during COVID, a lot of those people were actually our legal assistants, because a good portion of their job is making copies, getting the mail, scanning it, physically answering our hard lines. So during the thick of it, when we had those capacity restrictions, which you'll remember at one point were very low, we kind of focused on getting the people that had to physically be in the office. And then as the capacity has increased, incorporating everyone else. Most attorneys can work from home because we have the equipment. We don't necessarily have to see people in person. All the courts went remote. So attorneys, a lot of times it was easy for them to work from home. If we had people who couldn't for other reasons, they got distracted at home, their dog distracted them, their kids distracted them, they kind of got the priority, they got the first in the office. And then now we're at a place where we have welcomed everybody back. I mean, we only went to 100% in Rhode Island on the 21st, according to the order. But we're welcoming people back, and we have set out an expectation. Hey, we are expecting you're in the office 2 or 3 days a week, and that eventually you'll be 100% when you're ready. So we did kind of the recommended practice. I just said, giving some lead time. So it wasn't, Monday morning, we said every single person's got to be back in the office. If your job was one you're doing well at home, kind of to say, we do expect you to be somewhat in the office, and that eventually you're going to be back unless you have a special situation. And that seems to be working pretty well.
Phoebe, do you want to jump in on that one?
I agree with Alicia that the system worked great for our office. We allowed attorneys to work from home, but we also have been reporting the week before what days we'll be in the office. And that way our office manager has been able to coordinate who needs to be in and at what time. So that really worked well for us. But as lawyers, we've been able to do our job really well remotely, and the courts have been remote as well. So it's been a really good system for us. And now we're all phasing back into the office. So it's worked really well for us.
We have a question that's coming in. What do you do when a client comes in, and only wants to work with someone who is vaccinated?
So I'm going to be honest, I haven't personally had any clients ask me this, but I have had clients who've had clients. So you can absolutely grant that preference. So because the employer can mandate a vaccine, you can also grant the customer preference. Just as an aside, there's a very well-known customer preference doctrine that says if the preference is discriminatory or illegal, you can't grant that. So if you have a client saying, I only want to work with a woman, you can't say yes. But because the employer could actually mandate the vaccine, if the client wants to work with someone vaccinated, you absolutely can say yes. So it is another thing to think about. We didn't mention it, so I think that's a great question about vaccine tracking. It is possible we're going to see client preferences come forward. I have had clients who have said, look, I have customers who are saying, you can now send your vendors, your employees to our site, to our office, if they're vaccinated. If they're not vaccinated, we're not going to allow any other visitors like that. So all of a sudden, that's another really great example why you might at least want to know who is vaccinated and who isn't. I have had one client who have actually themselves said,
Phoebe? Alicia has frozen, so you have to finish the sentence.
Oh. I will let her jump back in. I'm not sure what she was going to say, but let's give her a minute.
Yeah, I think the overarching question is, what do you do when your own customers are creating a situation where they're asking for a certain subset of your employee base. And what I heard Alicia say is, as long as it's not a discriminatory reason, and that you in fact you can ask about vaccination status, and as a result, you then can match customers with those that are expressing a preference, a customer preference.
Exactly.
So Phoebe, what other key points do you hear from your clients?
So I think we've touched on everything already. The vaccine policies and how to approach the issue of employee vaccination is really a major issue right now. And just the changing orders that are affecting businesses. Everyone is working now with these changes in regulations and trying to adapt quickly. So we are just following those orders as they come out and working to help our clients to comply with them.
Okay. So I'm sorry that we lost Alicia. This time of day, 11:19 Eastern time, is a very crowded time on the broadband internet. So it doesn't surprise me that she froze up. But we have had a really good session. We've been going now for almost 80 minutes. But I want to give you, Phoebe, an opportunity to invite listeners to contact you directly, and what kind of services are you offering to folks that might have some additional questions, and how can they get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So our contact information is on the screen. You can contact Alicia or myself. Our phone numbers and our emails are there, and we represent employers or employees on really all areas of the employment law and any issues that may arise. So you can feel free to contact us. Also, as Alicia said, we're monitoring the new developments in COVID orders, and we're providing that information on our website. So as you can see, our COVID advisory group has that information available to everyone. So please feel free to check that out or contact us directly with any questions.
Okay, so Alicia and Phoebe are with the Employment Law Practice Group at Partridge, Snow and Hahn. The URL is psh.com, and the phone number, if you're just listening rather than looking at us on the screen, is 401-861-8200. And I would encourage everybody to sign up for their regular newsletter, which goes into a lot of detail that we covered today. And you would be able to stay up to date on everything that's happening, both on the federal level, state level, and also best practices and common themes that we're seeing emerge from employers. So there's lots of information out there. We're here to help folks that have questions, and I really thank you, Phoebe and Alicia, for spending the time with us today to walk through all the intricacies and the nuances of this issue. No doubt very complex, but up against the broader societal issues, the labor force issues, shortages, desire to continue to work from home, the anxiety around it, workforce shortages. Alicia, you are back.
I'm not frozen anymore.
So I think you were saying, I've even had a client that went as far as saying, and then
I've had at least one client adopt a policy saying, I don't want vendors or third parties in my building if they're not vaccinated. So it's a point we didn't bring up. I think that's a great question. This could be a trend that makes it really important for a business reason, that you start tracking who's vaccinated and maybe even mandating.
Okay, so we were just saying goodbye, Alicia, so I don't know if you have any final thoughts. Phoebe and I were chatting about how folks can contact you, your newsletter, ability to help stay up, your availability to help employers stay up with trends and ongoing issues. So anything you want to say in parting?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Lori. We had some great questions. Don't hesitate if you're watching this to reach out. And it's not attorney-client privileged communication, so please don't reach out and tell me all the illegal things you've been doing. But don't hesitate if you have a question to contact one of us or look on our website, which does have a lot of answers.
And that is ph.com. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.